Hello, this is Pastor Frank Lewis, and welcome to another program that's going to help you with your marriage. Going to help you not only with your marriage, going to help you in all your relationships. What we're going to talk about today is the truth of what we believe that's not true about ourselves. We believe things that aren't true because of the experiences that we've had as children. Remember I said weeks ago that Satan uses pain. Well, the key thing to that is that when Satan uses pain, it causes us to not be, I think I told you then, and I'm going to say it again, causes us not to be the people that God created us to be. And so what happens is that we believe things about ourselves that aren't true. Remember I told you last week when we first talked about brain science that the left side of our brain comes up with explanations, interpretations, judgments, and assumptions and presumptions. And today I'm going to tell you why every assumption, presumption, interpretation, judgment, that's probably why, it's really the reason why Jesus told us to not judge. All of those are incorrect whenever we have them, whenever we make them. Every explanation about every event, especially the painful ones that happens in our lives, is not true. And I'm going to prove it today because I'm going to show you where it all started, and it all started in the garden. It's going to help you in knowing what is the other part. Last week, you remember we talked about unresolved emotional pain. So this week we're talking about believing things that are not true because our left side of our brain causes us to believe things that are not true. And I'm going to explain how all that works, and it's going to be very good. You may want to get out a pencil and paper because I'm going to share some things with you I'm sure that you've not heard before. And that's going to be very important. One of the things that happens is when we believe things about ourselves that aren't true, what happens is that we will then not be the people that God created us to be. We won't believe we are the people that God created us to be. And so we can't do what God created us to do. And that's why Satan attacks us with pain as children, because we can't reason, we can't understand. It's really not our fault. That's certainly what happened to me, and that happens to all human beings. It's happened to you too. And so we want to look into why we believe the things that we do, because what we believe affects directly what we do, and that's important. And one of the things that we're going to talk about today is how what we believe actually overrides what we learn through our five physical senses, what we know through our five physical senses. Remember last week, I talked to you about that we know in a different way now, and I'm going to get deeper into that right now. We're going to talk about how and where this all started, and it all started in the garden. But before I do, I want to share with you that the basis, in fact, we're going to read out of this book today. I'm going to read it to you because I couldn't have said it better than I said it before. And this is the book, The Key. And you can get it on Amazon, and it'll bless you. I promise you, it'll change what you believe. I have a chapter in there on, actually it's chapter 9, I believe. Let me see. No, it's chapter 7, Brain Science and the Soul, God's Design. So that's going to help you a lot. The other thing that's going to help you is you can come to the website I have for relationshipsrevealed.org. The relationshipsrevealed.org is the address for some of the information about the books that I'm writing. The first one is on marriage, and that's what we're talking about today. But on that website, you can hit Want Help, and if you leave me your email or even your phone number, I'll get back to you. If you really want help, tell me why you want help. If you want to learn more, there's another button, and I can send you some more information or send you to another website. So if you scroll down, you'll be able to have a link to go right to Amazon to buy the book. The other thing you can do, that's very important, is that you can go to YouTube and look up Pastor Frank Lewis, and you'll see my playlist under Relationships Revealed. So that's how you can get more information. But today, now, we're going to dig into, where did this all start? How did we get into a place where every explanation, every interpretation, judgment, assumption or presumption is always 100% wrong? Well, it starts in the garden. And I'm going to actually read to you out of Genesis 3, and we're going to start with Genesis 2, actually, 2:25. And it says, and they were both naked, the man and his wife, and they weren't ashamed. They were naked, they weren't ashamed. Well, I believe that the reason they were naked and they weren't ashamed is because they didn't know evil. They had no evil in their lives. So what happened because of that is they could actually know, and by their experience was their truth, I can say it that way. Their experience was their reality. That's why God said, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Why? Well, here's what Satan had to say in Genesis. Let's go to Genesis 5. For God knows that in that day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So he said, you're going to know after you eat this fruit, and you're going to know good and evil. You'll be like God. You'll be like God, knowing good and evil. Well, Adam and Eve weren't satisfied with being who God created them to be, so they wanted to find out how to be more like God, and they ended up being less of themselves and less who God created them to be. But they knew, remember it says here, that they knew knowing good and evil. What Satan had said was they were going to know in a different way. Now they would know and experience what pain, shame, fear was actually what they experienced. But they knew in a different way. Here's what I believe happened. I believed that their knowing they were naked and they weren't ashamed. I believe they didn't know they were even naked. But what happened is after they disobeyed God, they now knew they were naked and they hid. It says further in Genesis 3, and they were afraid of God. So what happened? I believe that their 5 physical senses were switched on. Now they would know in a different way. They would not just know by experience. Their experience was no longer their truth. It was no longer their reality. Now they had a different way of knowing, and it was the 5 physical sense way of knowing. And that 5 physical sense way of knowing, the problem is that every time we end up in a situation where we rely on our 5 physical senses, it has to go by default through the knowledge of good and evil. And I'm going to read to you about that because I couldn't have said it better than the way I said it here. Everything they learned through their 5 physical senses then had to go through the screen of the knowledge of good and evil. They now knew good and evil, Genesis 3:10. They now knew many things they could see. They were naked. They felt shame. They knew they had disobeyed. They had done something wrong. Now they were afraid of God. From that point on, they would know their reality by their 5 physical senses. But their experience would still, here's the way God made it. The experiences that you've had as a child will still override what you know through your 5 physical senses. That's going to help you explain to you why it's so hard to trust God when your father or authority or your mother or your caretaker experienced through authority pain. Okay, that's why Satan has your father or mother or your caretakers cause you pain, because then that pain will cause you not to be the person that God created you to be, because it will override what God says in His Word, which is, for God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. God loves us, but I couldn't believe that, and you're probably having a hard time believing that because you didn't experience that. Experience still, even though we learn by our 5 physical senses, through our ear gate, our eye gate, our nose, our touch, and the 5 physical senses. Can't think of the other one right off the top of my head, but there's 5 of them. And so we learn, like if you go to church, you're going to learn through your ear gate. You maybe see it on the screen, so your eye gate. But what happens is you can read or hear at church that God loves you, and this is what the problem happened to me, but I couldn't believe it. Why? Because I didn't experience my Father loving me. I experienced my Father, what I thought and felt like He hated me. And you may have experienced the same thing. And so let me read on here. But their experiences would still override what they learned through their 5 physical senses because of how God made their brains to function. Remember what brain scientists tell us. If the left side explanation doesn't match up with the right side experience, the brain will shut down. The left side will shut down. And we know that because of the way that what we have experienced, the pain of that comes into the brain and shuts the left side down. We're going to find out there's another part of pain that also shuts the left side down, and that is this knowledge of good and evil problem that Adam and Eve caused us to have. So this is why I heard preaching that God loved me, which came through my ear gate and my eye gate, and the experience of the abuse of my father caused me not to believe God as the authority loved me. See, I put the face of my father on God. Everybody does that. Don't feel like you're alone in that. Everybody does that. That's what we've learned, is that we put the face of our father and mother on God. Or we end up in a position where we can't trust God and we can't trust authority. So who do we trust? We trust ourselves. And that's a big problem. It's a very big problem. So this took place below my conscious thought. So no matter how hard I tried to believe it was true, unless and until I had new experiences with God, which showed me His love, I could not believe it. This is true for you, and it's true for everyone. Here is what I believe happened to Adam and his wife. And I mentioned this, and we know that the left side of our brains make explanations, assumptions, judgments, and interpretation of everything we experienced. After they disobeyed, they would now know, as I mentioned, by their 5 physical senses. So, because of that, we end up having a default. It's actually a default because every explanation, every interpretation, every judgment, every assumption and presumption has to go through the screen of the knowledge of good and evil. Think about it this way. I think this will help explain it. Your computer defaults to certain things that it's set up to default to. There's nothing you can do. You can override it, but it defaults automatically. What happens here is that that's what happens to us. When we as children experience pain that Satan brings through fathers and mothers, being triggered, emotionally upset, and acting out on us, what happens is we now have an explanation. In my case, I was in my high chair and I was being fed peas, and what happened is I spit them out because I didn't like their consistency. My dad slapped me on the hand and he yelled at me because he was triggered. I didn't know that, but what was the explanation that happened after that? Not that I did something bad, but that I was bad, and Satan reinforced it over and over and over again till I believed I was worthless, I believed I was defective, and I even hated myself because my father treated me like he hated me. That may have happened to you. And if it has, now you're going to understand why life is so difficult, why the Christian life is so difficult. It should be easier. Well, it can be when you get unresolved emotional pain on one side and faulty explanations healed on the other side. So it's very, very important. Now, let's read on. It is painful experiences which Satan and his courts want to make sure are misinterpreted, and this is very easily done to babies, infants, and young children who can't reason. I couldn't reason at age 2, so I believed I was bad. That was the explanation. The knowledge of good and evil explanation about a painful event we experience becomes a false belief. Remember, John 8:44 says Satan is the father of false belief, father of lies. There is no truth in him, he's a liar. Once we have this belief, then Satan comes and reinforces it over and over and over again, like what happened to me. So, what I believe from the knowledge of good and evil were reinforced over and over again. That's what's happened with you. And so what I believed about myself, was that true? Was I not valuable, not important, not worthy? No, it wasn't. But it's what I believe from the faulty explanations and misinterpretations. I spent 50 years of my life, get this, write this down, because you've done the same thing, trying to prove that I was valuable, important, and worthy. And since my dad was a doctor, and we lived in a 4,000 square foot house, I ended up trying to prove it by making money. I did make a lot of money, but the problem was it didn't change what I believed, because what I believed was overridden by my experiences, that I wasn't valuable, important, and worthy because I experienced that with my father. That's exactly what's happened to you. It happens to all human beings, and it's so important for you to know that, because you can't override it just by willpower. You can't just say, well, I'm going to think differently. I'm going to be different. I'm going to have a new identity. People get born again, come into the family of God because they've accepted Jesus Christ as Lord, and that is the key. That's the first step, if you will. But they think all things are new and all old things have passed away. That's in the spirit. That's not in the soul. We still believe things as Christians that are not who we really are. Our identity has been absolutely deformed. It's been overridden by painful experiences. So we're not the people that God created us to be, and we need healing, emotional healing, to become those people. But let me read a little bit more here. The problem is, when I made big money, it did not change my sense of value. the very sad thing is that what I was doing and what you're doing, whatever you're doing to try to prove that you're valuable, important, and worthy is based on false beliefs, misinterpretations of painful childhood events. I spent 50 years of my life trying to make a lot of money. It didn't change anything. It won't change anything for you. It's not going to change anything. And that's really sad. That is really sad. This is why I lived on the rim. You remember I talked to you about that before. Going around in circles. This is why life is so hard. Going around in circles and getting beaten up by Satan. Why? Because I was doing what I was doing based upon false belief, based upon things I believed about myself that weren't true. I was trying to prove that they weren't true. But I never could prove because it was all based on something that wasn't true. You get that? It's really important you get that. I spent 50 years of my life trying to prove I was valuable, important, and worthy when I already was valuable, important, and worthy according to God. But I couldn't trust God, so I didn't believe. And brain scientists tell us what I experienced is always going to override what God said in His Word. Unless it's revealed to me in some way. So this is very important. What you're going to find out in the weeks ahead is that life is so difficult because of these false beliefs. So if we change the false beliefs, life is going to get better. You're going to be able to trust God more. You're going to have a better life. You're going to have a better marriage. Going to have a better marriage when we get emotional healing. My whole goal of writing this book is to help you to get emotionally healed. First of all, understand the problem. Second of all, know about brain science, and then get emotionally healed the way God showed me how to do it so that you don't have to take the next 25, 30 years to learn by experiencing God going up the mountain, down the mountain, up the mountain, down the mountain, and like I did. I didn't want anybody to go through what I went through. And so that's why I wrote this book. That's why you need this book. That's why you need to know what I'm sharing if you're married, because it's going to make a big difference. I'm not the only one who's done this. Most Christians are doing the same thing I did in one way or another because of the false beliefs. You, like me, believe things about yourself that aren't true because of these painful childhood events. And it's so important for you to understand this. So you need to realize that these things you believe about yourself that aren't true, just like I believed about myself that weren't true, are going to cause you to end up having problems in your marriage. Here's the other thing that happens. When you experience anything that's remotely similar to painful childhood events, not only is there unresolved emotional pain coming into your brain, but there's also the pain of beliefs, believing things that aren't true, the pain of believing you're not valuable, important, and worthy. That's painful, and it comes into your brain and shuts the left side down. So it's very important that you understand that you're believing things about who you are that are not true. And God doesn't want He designed our brains so that we are not going to continue believing things about ourselves that aren't true. And as I said last week, we're going to know that we have unresolved emotional pain. So Satan has done a work by causing children to feel the pain that they felt and then reinforced it over and over again until they believe things about themselves that aren't true. It's not the identity that you and I need in order to fulfill our call, to reach our destiny. It's not. It's not going to work that way. So what's going to happen is I am going to help you. You're going to say to me, well, what's the answer? And I'm going to say this. Brain scientists tell us, in order to be able to override a false belief, a misinterpretation, a false judgment, erroneous assumptions and presumptions, we must have new truthful experiences. Well, the way that I know to have the most truthful experiences is with God. But see, that's why Satan set it up, so we can't trust God. But the main thing is that I'm going to show you what God showed me. Next week, we'll start it. I will show you what God showed me as to how to resolve emotional pain and change what we believe. Because brain scientists tell us we can do it. And guess what? You're going to love this. It's permanent. Once we have a new truthful experience, then we change a false belief and it's permanent. So, the more truthful experiences we have, the more God experiences we have, we're going to end up having less and less false beliefs, less and less unresolved emotional pain, and we're going to get to have the abundant life. You're going to have a great marriage. You're going to be having great relationships. Your marriage is going to be incredible when we get into that part of it. But remember the book. The book is a very important foundation piece. You can get it on Amazon. And I just want to tell you that God loves you. He has given me this knowledge so that you don't perish in your marriage, in your family, that you have the best marriage possible. You have a marriage made in heaven. I'm sharing this with you because I have learned it the hard way. But I want you to have it in a way that is not, you're not going to have so much pain. You're going to be able to become more the people God created you to be, more the person God created you to be. And it's not going to be so difficult as what I had to experience because God loves you and I'm here for you. And I've written this book to help you, and I'm writing this book on marriage to make a difference in your marriage